The flight was never meant to stand out. It was late in the war, when the skies over Europe were crowded with desperation, retreat, and exhaustion, and this particular mission carried none of the drama usually associated with aerial combat. The pilot was a Luftwaffe officer with years of experience, assigned to ferry a single-engine aircraft from one airfield to another deeper inside occupied territory. It was a transfer flight, routine, administrative, almost dull by wartime standards. He had flown this type of route before, under worse conditions, and survived. That morning the weather brief was cautious but not alarming. Low cloud cover, intermittent rain, visibility reduced in patches but flyable. No major storm systems were expected, and enemy air activity in the region had dropped sharply as fronts shifted elsewhere. The aircraft itself had passed inspection the day before. Fuel levels were confirmed. No mechanical warnings were logged. On paper, nothing about the flight suggested danger. He took off just after midday. Ground crews watched the plane lift cleanly from the runway and disappear into a gray, uneven sky. There was no ceremony, no sense of finality, just another aircraft swallowed by clouds. For the first hour, radio contact was uneventful. The pilot checked in at scheduled intervals, his voice calm, professional, almost bored. He confirmed altitude, heading, and weather conditions. He reported light turbulence but nothing unexpected. Controllers logged each transmission with the efficiency of men who had done this thousands of times before. Then, during what should have been another routine check-in, something changed. The transmission came in fragmented, not garbled, but abruptly cut. The pilot's voice was audible for only a moment mid-sentence before the signal dropped completely. There was no panic in his tone, no raised voice, no words like engine, fire, or enemy. Just a sentence that never finished. Controllers waited. They called back on the same frequency, then on secondary channels. There was no response. At first, no one panicked. Radio silence happened. Equipment failed. Signals bounced unpredictably in bad weather. They logged the missed transmission and continued calling at intervals, expecting the pilot to reappear on the line. He never did. As the minutes stretched into an hour, concern began to replace routine. His projected flight path was traced on maps spread across tables already cluttered with dozens of other missing aircraft routes. Controllers calculated fuel range, estimated drift, and possible diversion points. If he had turned back, he should have been visible by now. If he had landed at an alternate field, there would have been word. By late afternoon, the aircraft was officially overdue. The first assumption was mechanical failure. It was the most common explanation, especially in the final year of the war when aircraft were flown hard and maintained under constant strain. An engine failure at low altitude, combined with poor visibility, could send a plane down without warning. The second assumption was enemy action. Even though combat activity was lighter in the region, Allied fighters still patrolled aggressively, and not every engagement was witnessed or recorded. What troubled the controllers was what hadn't happened. There had been no mayday call, no emergency code, no distress signal. Even pilots hit by surprise often managed a few seconds of warning. This pilot had time to speak, but not enough to explain. By nightfall, the aircraft was classified as missing. Search operations began the next morning, following standard wartime procedure. Reconnaissance planes were dispatched to sweep the projected corridor of flight, scanning forests, rivers, and fields for wreckage or smoke. Ground units were alerted to report any crash sites, fires, or civilian sightings, but the search was constrained almost immediately by reality. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft were needed elsewhere. Weather deteriorated again, grounding some flights entirely. The search area was vast, crossing terrain that had already absorbed years of destruction. Burned villages, cratered farmland, and abandoned roads made distinguishing a fresh crash from old damage nearly impossible. Reports trickled in, but none were definitive. A farmer claimed to have heard an aircraft flying low in the distance. A rail worker reported a loud engine noise followed by silence, but no visual confirmation. Another witness described seeing clouds shift suddenly, as if disturbed by something passing through, but nothing more. No wreckage was found, no debris field, no oil slick in nearby rivers, no confirmed eyewitnesses. Within days, priorities shifted. The war was reaching a critical phase. Entire squadrons were disappearing every week. Command centers were overwhelmed by losses too numerous to investigate deeply. The missing pilot's file was marked, categorized, and placed among hundreds of others awaiting resolution that might never come. A formal notice was prepared and sent to his family. The letter was brief, written in the restrained language of military bureaucracy. It informed them that their son and husband had failed to return from a flight assignment and was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. There was no cause of loss specified, no location, no recovery details, just the assurance that all reasonable efforts had been made. For his family, the absence of details was worse than confirmation of death. There was no grave to mourn at, no body to bury, no final story to cling to. His last known words were trapped in a broken radio transmission, inaccessible and incomplete. They waited for updates that never came. As weeks passed, hope eroded quietly. The war ended, borders shifted, records were reorganized, lost, or destroyed. Investigators moved on. The missing pilot's name remained on lists of the unrecovered, slowly sinking into the background noise of history. Yet even then, there were details that never quite settled. No combat reports matched his disappearance. No Allied claims corresponded to an aircraft downed in that area on that day. No crash site was ever identified, despite extensive post-war reconstruction and farming. The aircraft simply vanished between one radio call and the next. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it lingered, frozen in a moment of silence, suspended between assumption and proof. The kind of disappearance that war produced in abundance, but that never fully explained itself. For decades, it would exist only as a line in an archive and a question left unanswered, waiting for something, anything, to surface and disturb the quiet conclusion everyone had learned to accept. When the war ended, it did not bring clarity. It brought paper. Across Europe, military offices filled with crates of captured documents, flight logs, intelligence summaries, and loss reports, some meticulously kept, others hastily scribbled during retreat. Allied analysts were tasked with sorting through what remained of the Luftwaffe's operational history, reconciling claims with wreckage, and accounting for aircraft that had vanished into the final chaos of the conflict. Most cases followed familiar patterns. A downed plane here, a confirmed crash site there. Eyewitness statements matched to serial numbers. Deaths, though tragic, were usually traceable. This one was not. When Allied intelligence officers cross-referenced the missing pilot's flight with German loss records, the gaps became impossible to ignore. There was no entry confirming destruction, no notation of enemy engagement, no mention of mechanical failure. The aircraft was simply listed as missing, with no follow-up, an administrative dead end in a system that, even in collapse, tended to leave a trail. Radar logs from the region were examined next. Late-war radar coverage was imperfect, fragmented by bombing and power shortages, but it still recorded enough to reconstruct many aerial movements. For the time window when the pilot disappeared, there were no unidentified blips descending rapidly, no sudden signal losses consistent with a crash. Allied fighters operating nearby reported no engagements matching the aircraft's description, no gun camera footage, no claims filed. The silence was complete. Investigators widened their scope, turning to civilian testimony collected during post-war debriefings. Along the aircraft's projected flight corridor, villagers had been questioned about everything from troop movements to stray artillery fire. Buried among those reports were a handful of small, easily overlooked statements. Several civilians recalled hearing an aircraft that afternoon, Not high overhead, but low enough that the engine noise lingered, heavy and deliberate. None of them reported explosions. No columns of smoke. No fires. One railway worker remembered pausing because the sound seemed unusually close to the ground, then fatting abruptly. He waited for the impact that never came. The most unsettling account came from a farmer whose land bordered a stretch of trees near the edge of the flight path. He described seeing an aircraft emerge beneath the cloud cover, flying lower than expected, its silhouette briefly visible against the lighter sky. According to him, the plane passed behind the trees and simply never reappeared. There was no crash sound, no tearing metal, just the engine noise cutting off as if the aircraft had been swallowed by the landscape. At the time, his statement was logged and dismissed. Farmers heard many things during the war. Fear distorted memory. Planes passed daily, and not all disappearances meant disaster. Without wreckage, there was nothing to investigate. Still, when intelligence officers revisited the file years later, the consistency of the civilian report stood out. Different people, different locations, but the same absence of violence. No explosion, no smoke, no evidence of a high-speed impact. Attention then turned back to the pilot himself. His service record showed a man shaped by routine, not recklessness. He had completed dozens of operational flights without incident. Instructors' notes described him as methodical, cautious, sometimes even overly conservative in marginal weather. He was not known for improvisation or risk-taking. He followed procedures. He trusted checklists. The aircraft he flew was also examined. It was a model known for durability, forgiving handling, and reliable engines. Not immune to failure, but far from fragile. Statistically, sudden catastrophic breakdown without warning was rare. When it did happen, pilots usually had seconds, sometimes only moments, but enough to transmit something. A word, a warning, a reason. In this case, there had been none. Investigators began to use a word they rarely applied lightly: anomalous. Not publicly, not in official summaries, but in internal notes, the case was quietly flagged as not fitting established patterns. Mechanical failure without distress call, enemy action without evidence, a disappearance without physical trace. Each explanation on its own was plausible. Together, they strained credibility. Even so, nothing moved forward. The post-war years were defined by scale. Tens of thousands of missing personnel. Entire units lost without records. Governments focused on reconstruction, not mysteries with no clear path to resolution. Resources were finite, and cases without new evidence were pushed aside. The pilot's name was engraved on memorials dedicated to the missing. His status was formalized as presumed dead. His family was encouraged, gently but firmly, to accept the conclusion and move on. They tried. But absence is a different kind of wound. Without remains, grief never fully settles. Every rumor, every article about recovered aircraft, every story of a pilot found years later reopened questions they had been told were closed. Letters were written to archives. Inquiries were sent and politely declined. The answers never changed. Over time, the case receded from institutional memory. Files yellowed. Witnesses aged or died. The farmland beneath the old flight path was plowed year after year, its surface revealing nothing unusual. The war's scars faded, replaced by crops, fences, and roads. On paper, the disappearance was resolved. In reality, it remained suspended in uncertainty, a loss that refused to conform, a vanishing that left no physical proof of death. The kind of case that survives only because it never quite explains itself. And as decades passed, the question persisted quietly beneath official conclusions, waiting for the one thing that could no longer be dismissed: evidence. Because if the aircraft had not crashed violently, and if the pilot had not died in the sky, then somewhere beneath the ordinary ground people walked across every day, the truth had not been destroyed, only hidden. Time has a way of flattening history. What once felt urgent becomes distant, then ordinary, then invisible. The region where the pilot vanished changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, year by year. The war ended. Borders were redrawn. Roads were paved over old supply routes. Bomb craters were filled. Fields were reclaimed and planted again, season after season, until the land carried no obvious memory of what had passed through it. Farmers worked the soil where soldiers once marched. Children grew up playing in areas their grandparents had avoided. The sky that had once been crowded with aircraft returned to quiet, broken only by weather and the occasional civilian plane. The missing pilot became a name in an archive, then a name on a stone, then a name no one spoke aloud anymore. Nearly 8 decades passed that way. The rediscovery did not come from historians or families still searching for closure. It came from paperwork. A routine agricultural land assessment commissioned as part of a regional development program. The goal was mundane: map soil composition, identify buried hazards, and ensure large equipment could be used safely. As part of the process, surveyors ran ground-penetrating scans across several open fields that had been farmed continuously since the 1950s. Most scans showed what was expected: layers of soil, occasional rocks, rusted remnants of farming tools lost decades earlier, but one field returned something different. Beneath a broad stretch of cultivated land, the equipment detected a dense metallic mass several meters below the surface. At first, it was assumed to be scrap, perhaps a forgotten tank, or wartime debris pushed underground during post-war cleanup. The region was no stranger to unexploded ordnance, and such anomalies were usually flagged, documented, and dealt with quietly. What made this one stand out was its shape. The signal was not irregular or fragmented. It was smooth, curved, symmetrical, too large to be a single piece of debris and too refined to be random. Surveyors ran the scan again, adjusting angles and depth. The shape remained consistent: long, narrow, with extensions that suggested wings. The initial report was cautious. The anomaly was logged as a potential hazard, likely wartime in origin. Local authorities were notified and the site was temporarily marked off. No one made bold claims. No one said aircraft. Not yet. A second scan was conducted weeks later, this time with higher resolution equipment. The results only deepened the unease. The object was intact enough to retain its overall structure. There was no sign of explosive fragmentation around it, no scattering of metal. It appeared to be lying in one piece, embedded in compacted soil. Still, skepticism remained. The land had been farmed for generations. If something that large had crashed there, someone would have noticed. There would have been stories, scars, a reason the field had been avoided. Yet there were none. Permission was eventually granted for a controlled excavation. The process moved slowly, deliberately. The assumption was still that this was either unexploded ordnance or scrap metal from the war years, and caution dictated every step. Heavy machinery was kept at a distance as soil was removed layer by hand and small equipment. At first, nothing unusual appeared, just dark earth compressed by decades of farming. Then, several meters down, a different texture emerged. The soil grew denser, disturbed in a way that suggested something large had displaced it long ago. And then metal appeared. Not jagged, not rusted into fragments, smooth, curved aluminum, dull but unmistakably manufactured. As more earth was cleared, the shape became undeniable. A fuselage. Sections of wing folded inward by pressure, not torn apart by force. Rivets still aligned. Panels bent but not shredded. The excavation team stopped work immediately and expanded the perimeter. Experts were called in: archaeologists, military historians, explosive ordnance specialists. Each approached the site expecting to find evidence of a violent crash. Instead, what emerged contradicted almost every assumption they brought with them. The aircraft was buried, not destroyed. As more of it was exposed, The lack of a debris field became impossible to ignore. There were no scattered parts radiating outward, no signs of fire damage, no burn marks in the surrounding soil. The ground above showed no indication that a high-speed impact had ever occurred there. It was as if the plane had been placed into the earth, rather than slammed into it. Serial numbers were uncovered along the fuselage, partially preserved beneath layers of soil. When they were documented and cross-referenced, the results sent a quiet shock through everyone involved. The aircraft was a German military plane from the Second World War. Its registration matched records of aircraft listed as missing, not destroyed, during the final year of the conflict. One of those records belonged to a pilot who had vanished during a routine transfer flight and was never recovered. The location matched his projected flight path almost exactly. As news of the find spread, questions multiplied faster than answers. How had an entire aircraft remained hidden beneath a working field for nearly 80 years? Why were there no surface indications? Why had no one ever reported a crash there? Investigators walked the surrounding land, searching for any trace of impact or disturbance. There were none. The field sloped gently, uninterrupted by scars or depressions. Historical aerial photographs were pulled from archives and compared across decades. Even in images taken shortly after the war, the land appeared unremarkable, plowed, cultivated, unchanged. The only conclusion that fit the evidence was the most unsettling one. The plane had not crashed violently. Somehow it had come down intact, or nearly so, and then disappeared beneath the surface over time, aided by factors no one could yet fully explain. Natural sedimentation, human intervention, or both. What was certain was that the aircraft had not simply fallen out of the sky and been forgotten. Its presence beneath the field required a sequence of events that contradicted the official story of a wartime loss. And as investigators prepared to look inside the buried fuselage, one question overshadowed all the others. If the plane had landed, or been brought down, without catastrophic damage, then what had happened to the man who was supposed to be inside it? The decision to open the aircraft was not treated as a discovery moment, but as a recovery. By the time forensic teams were cleared to work inside the buried fuselage, expectations had been tempered by what the exterior had already revealed. This was not wreckage in the conventional sense. It was an object that had endured pressure, time, and silence, yet resisted destruction. Every movement around the aircraft was slow, documented, measured. Soil was brushed away rather than scraped. Panels were stabilized before being shifted. Nothing about the condition of the plane suggested violence. There were no twisted fragments, no explosive tears in the metal. The wings were bent inward, not sheared off, as if weight had pressed down on them over years rather than impact ripping them away in seconds. The cockpit canopy was still closed. That detail unsettled nearly everyone involved. In most crash recoveries, the canopy is shattered or forced open by the pilot in the final moments. Here, it sat sealed, its frame warped but intact. When it was finally lifted, the interior air escaped with no smell of fire, no residue of fuel burn. The cockpit was dark, cramped, and eerily preserved. The instrument panel told a quiet story. Gauges were frozen mid-reading. Altitude indicated low but controlled flight. Airspeed was steady, not spiking or dropping sharply. There was no sign of a last-second dive or desperate maneuver. The engine controls were not pushed to emergency limits. Everything suggested intention, not panic. And the pilot's seat was empty. There were no skeletal remains, no fragments of bone, no trace of a body decomposed into the soil beneath. The harness straps lay loose, unbuckled. The seat cushion showed wear consistent with long use, but no sign of catastrophic force. Whatever had happened, the pilot had not died in that cockpit. The absence hit harder than any wreckage could have. Investigators widened their search within the fuselage, cataloging everything that remained. A folded flight map was found tucked into a side compartment. It was marked with the assigned route, but also with alternate paths, penciled in lightly, careful, deliberate. Some diverted around weather systems. Others skirted areas known for Allied patrols. It was the kind of preparation made by someone thinking ahead, planning contingencies. A wristwatch was recovered from the cockpit floor. Its glass was cracked, but the casing remained intact. When examined, it had stopped several hours after the pilot's last radio transmission, not at the moment of disappearance, not during impact, but later. That detail shifted the timeline in a way no one expected. A partially used survival kit was found behind the seat. Some items were missing, others remained untouched. The kit had not exploded open or scattered during a crash. It had been accessed deliberately. Someone had reached for it, removed what they needed, and left the rest behind. There were no bloodstains, no signs of injury inside the cockpit, no damage consistent with a violent landing. The aircraft appeared to have come down under control, or at least without catastrophic failure. Attention turned back to the soil itself. Geologists and forensic specialists examined the layers surrounding the plane. The stratification was uneven but not chaotic. There were no signs of a sudden collapse or crater formation. Instead, the soil appeared to have settled over time, gradually enveloping the aircraft. Some layers suggested natural sedimentation, rain, flooding, seasonal movement of Earth. Others hinted at disturbance inconsistent with pure erosion. In places, the soil was more compacted than expected, as if it had been tamped down or manipulated. No clear tool marks were found, no definitive evidence of deliberate burial, but the pattern did not support a single, violent event. Whatever forces had hidden the aircraft had acted slowly, incrementally, or deliberately enough to leave little trace. Investigators reconstructed possible scenarios, each one raising new questions. One theory suggested the pilot had made a controlled landing in an open field, possibly due to weather or mechanical concerns that never escalated to emergency. After landing, he may have concealed the aircraft to avoid detection, then attempted to move on foot. In the chaos of the war's final months, such an action would not have been unthinkable. Another theory proposed intervention, that someone else, civilians, soldiers, or occupying forces, had encountered the downed plane and chosen to hide it. Whether out of fear, opportunism, or orders never recorded, the result would have been the same: an aircraft erased from sight without being destroyed. But none of the theories explain the pilot's complete disappearance. Search teams expanded outward from the excavation site, scanning nearby land for human remains, personal items, or signs of a campsite. Nothing surfaced. No bones, no clothing, no trace that a man had walked away from the plane and died nearby. The deeper investigators went, the more the case resisted closure. The aircraft told a story of survival beyond the moment of disappearance, the watch stopping hours later, the survival kit being opened, the absence of trauma. All signs pointed to a pilot who lived through the landing. But survival raised its own, more troubling questions. If he walked away, where did he go? If he was captured, why was there no record? If he was killed afterward, why was there no body? If he vanished intentionally, how did he disappear so completely in a landscape crawling with soldiers, civilians, and checkpoints? Each answer required silence from dozens of people across decades. By the time the aircraft was fully documented, one truth had become unavoidable. The original wartime conclusion that the pilot died in a crash was wrong. He did not perish in the sky. He did not burn with his aircraft. He did not vanish in an instant. His story continued on the ground. And somewhere beyond the buried fuselage, beyond the field that concealed it for nearly 80 years, the final chapter of his disappearance waited, tied not to aviation, but to human decisions made in the shadow of a collapsing war. Once the aircraft was removed from the ground and the initial forensic work completed, the case entered its most unstable phase. The evidence no longer supported a simple wartime loss, but it also refused to point cleanly toward any single explanation. What followed was not a breakthrough, but a widening of theories, of speculation, of uncomfortable possibilities that had been ignored for nearly 8 decades. The first theory to gain traction was defection. It was not as dramatic as it sounded. By the final year of the war, defections were rare but not unheard of. Some pilots, exhausted and disillusioned, chose survival over loyalty. The conditions were right. The pilot had been flying alone. His route crossed territory where Allied forces were advancing rapidly. If he believed capture was inevitable, landing intact and disappearing might have seemed like the only way out. Supporters of this theory pointed to the flight map. The alternate routes penciled in were not unusual, but one line stood out, an intentional deviation that could have led him away from both German airfields and heavily patrolled Allied zones. The survival kit being partially used suggested preparation beyond a crash scenario. The watch stopping hours later implied time spent alive after landing. But defection raised its own problems. There was no record of him surrendering. Allied intelligence kept detailed logs of defectors, even those captured unofficially. They were interrogated, cataloged, exploited for information. A trained Luftwaffe pilot would have been valuable, yet his name appeared nowhere in Allied archives. No alias, no matching description, no photograph tied to a different identity. If he defected, he did so without ever being acknowledged, and then vanished again. The second theory was quieter and more consistent with the chaos of the period: unofficial capture. In the war's final months, record-keeping collapsed. Units advanced faster than paperwork. Prisoners were taken, moved, and sometimes lost in the system. Some died before processing. Others were handed off between forces without proper documentation. A man captured without an aircraft, on foot, injured or exhausted, could easily slip through the cracks. This theory gained weight when researchers began re-examining Allied interrogation summaries from the region. Among thousands of pages, one brief entry stood out. It referenced a German pilot captured in the area during the same time frame. The note was vague. No rank, no name, just a description: captured without aircraft. No follow-up appeared anywhere in the file. There was no interrogation transcript, no transfer record, no death certificate. The pilot simply existed for a moment on paper, then disappeared again. It was impossible to prove the entry referred to the missing man, but impossible to ignore the coincidence. Still, that explanation failed to answer what happened next. Even undocumented prisoners usually left some trace: a burial record, a camp log, a mention in correspondence. Here, there was nothing. The third theory was the most uncomfortable and the hardest to dismiss. It suggested that the pilot landed intact and encountered civilians before any military force reached him. The war had turned ordinary people into unwilling participants in violence and secrecy. Fear ruled decision-making. A downed enemy pilot could bring danger to anyone who helped him, or anyone who didn't. In this version of events, the landing itself was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something quieter and darker. Local oral histories began to surface as word of the discovery spread. Not official statements, not sworn testimony. Conversations recorded by historians, fragments shared reluctantly, often followed by long pauses. People spoke carefully, even now. One elderly resident recalled being told as a child to avoid a particular field after the war. No reason was given, just an order. The field, according to him, was left untouched for years despite being fertile land. When asked why, his parents told him it was not safe, but never explained how. Another account described soldiers arriving shortly after the war ended, instructing locals to stay away from a specific area. There was no mention of an aircraft, no visible wreckage, just an insistence that the land remain undisturbed. Within a few years, the warning stopped. Farming resumed. Silence returned. These stories could not be verified. Memories faded. Timelines blurred. But their existence suggested something unspoken, a shared understanding that had been buried along with the plane. Investigators were careful not to accuse. There was no evidence of violence against the pilot, no remains, no weapons found. But the absence itself became suspicious. A man survived a landing, left his aircraft, and then vanished completely in a populated area. That required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary silence. Each theory solved part of the puzzle, while deepening another mystery. Defection explained the intact landing, but not the missing records. Capture explained the disappearance from the aircraft, but not the lack of documentation. Civilian involvement explained the silence, but not the absence of physical proof. The war, it seemed, had created conditions where truth could be erased without leaving marks. As investigators compared timelines, one final pattern emerged. Every explanation depended on a short window of time, hours, perhaps a day after the landing. That window had never been documented. No reports, no sightings, no records. Whatever happened to the pilot occurred in that gap before systems of order reasserted themselves. And once the order returned, it was too late. The aircraft remained hidden. The man was gone. The land absorbed both. By the time modern investigators exhausted the theories, they were forced to confront an unsettling conclusion. The pilot's fate might never be known with certainty, not because evidence was destroyed, but because it was never created in the first place. Silence, once chosen, had done its work well. Yet even as the case resisted resolution, the discovery of the buried aircraft had already changed its status forever. The pilot was no longer just missing. He was no longer presumed dead without question. He had survived beyond the sky. His story had continued on the ground, shaped by human decisions made under pressure, fear, and uncertainty. The final task was no longer to explain how he vanished, but to decide how history would remember him now that the truth, however incomplete, had finally come back to the surface. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, expectations had shifted. There was no longer a belief that one document, one witness, or one overlooked artifact would suddenly resolve everything. What remained was the slow work of drawing boundaries around what could be proven and acknowledging what could not. The official findings were careful, restrained, and unusually candid. The aircraft, investigators concluded, had not crashed in the conventional sense. Evidence supported a controlled or semi-controlled landing during the final year of the war. The absence of fire damage, the condition of the fuselage, the intact instrumentation, and the lack of a debris field all pointed in the same direction. Whatever problem the pilot encountered in the air, he managed it long enough to bring the plane down without catastrophic failure. The burial, they determined, was not the result of a single event. There was no crater collapse, no landslide large enough to swallow an aircraft whole. Instead, the plane had been concealed gradually, through a combination of natural sediment buildup and human interference. Flooding patterns in the region, soil compression over decades, and subtle disturbances suggested the land had been encouraged to close over the aircraft, whether intentionally or not. The report avoided assigning blame. It did not speculate on motives. It did not accuse civilians, soldiers, or authorities of deliberate concealment. It simply stated that the plane had been hidden in a way inconsistent with accident alone. As for the pilot, the conclusion was more difficult. There was no physical evidence of his death, no remains, no confirmed records of capture or defection, but there was clear evidence that he survived the landing at least for a period of time. The wristwatch, the opened survival kit, the unbuckled harness, these were not details that could be explained away. As a result, his status was formally changed. He was no longer listed as killed in action. he was reclassified as missing, with evidence of survival beyond the aircraft's landing. It was an administrative change, but for those who had followed the case, it carried emotional weight. It acknowledged what had been quietly suspected since the moment the buried fuselage emerged from the soil, that history had been wrong about how his story ended. The announcement did not bring closure, but it brought honesty. In the months that followed, the excavation site transformed. What had once been an unremarkable stretch of farmland became a place of attention and reflection. Temporary fencing was removed. A small clearing was established. The ground, now disturbed for the first time in generations, was leveled and stabilized. A memorial was planned, not by the state, but by a collaboration of historians, local officials, and families of missing airmen from all sides of the war. There was debate about how it should be framed, whether it should name the pilot directly, whether it should emphasize military service or human loss. In the end, the memorial was simple. A stone marker was placed near the center of the field. It did not mark a grave. There was no body beneath it. Instead, it marked a truth long ignored, that a man had come down alive here, and that whatever happened next had been lost to time and silence. At the dedication, there were no speeches about heroism, no flags raised, no attempt to resolve what could not be resolved. Attendees stood quietly, many of them descendants of people who had lived in the area during the war, others connected only by shared absence, relatives of men who never came home from every uniform. The field felt different now, not dramatic, not haunted in the way stories often suggest, just altered. The knowledge of what lay beneath, or had once lain beneath, changed how people stood there, how they looked across the open land. For decades, tractors had passed over that spot. Crops had grown and been harvested. Children had run across it, none of them knowing that beneath their feet was an aircraft that should have been found in 1945, and a story that should have ended but did not. The investigation closed without a final answer about the pilot's fate. There were no last-minute discoveries, no deathbed confessions, no hidden letters surfaced to explain what happened in the hours after the landing. The silence held. But the meaning of that silence had changed. Before, it had been assumed to represent death, instant, unremarkable, unexamined. Now it represented something more complex, survival without record, decisions made in fear or exhaustion, a human life passing through a gap in history where documentation failed. The mystery was not solved, but it was no longer invisible. The aircraft, once buried and forgotten, now sat preserved in sections, studied and cataloged. Its story added to the record of a war that still revealed new truths generations later. And the pilot, once written off as another casualty, was remembered instead as a man who made it to the ground, and then vanished. In the end, that may be the most unsettling part of the story. Not that the plane was lost for 79 years beneath an ordinary field, but that the answer was there the entire time, hidden in plain sight, while the man who flew it slipped quietly out of history, leaving behind nothing but evidence that he survived, and a question no one can now fully answer. The field gave back the aircraft. It did not give back the pilot. And that absence remains, not as a failure of investigation, but as a reminder of how easily a human life can disappear, even when the ground itself remembers.